Good morning and welcome. This is again Mr. Duran, and we're going to continue our work with GameMaker Studio 2. So I've added a little bit of code in here just to make sure I have the full functionality to allow my character to move left, right, and all around the world. What we're going to be focusing on today is how to get our character, our player model, to be able to move more than just around the world, but to also follow our cursor whenever it goes onto the screen, and then respond to left mouse clicks by creating a projectile and launching it. So first up, let's go ahead and take a look at getting the program to follow our cursor. So we're going to go back to the step event for our player object. And somewhere down below, we're going to address following cursor. And again, our cursor is the mouse on the screen. The way we can do this is by specifying the image angle of our player object and set it to point towards the direction of from our origin point over to our mouse's X value and our mouse's Y value. If I save this, run it, give it a second to build up, we'll be able to see how we have our current operations going. So as you can see, my little UFO follows around my cursor, and if I do WASD, it moves around the world just fine. And notice it is absolute, so if I press W, it's going to be moving up on the screen regardless of what direction it is looking at. So just be aware of it. Now that we've got some response to our cursor, just at least looking at the cursor, next thing I want to do is create a projectile, being able to launch something outwards. So we're going to first have to create a sprite to represent our projectile. So I'm going to right click on the sprites folder, create a brand new sprite. And here we go. Let's go ahead and edit the image a bit. What do I want my sprite to launch out? Maybe a little yellow object, like a little yellow arrow. I'm no artist, so that's not going to be the prettiest thing to look at, but it'll do the job. That looks even to me. I'll go ahead and refer to this as SPR projectile, save it, and then set the origin to be here near the center. Control S, and it's saved. We now have our sprite projectile. Let's go ahead and create our sprite object. So I'm going to go over to the objects folder, right click on it, create a new object. I'm going to grab my sprite for the projectile that I just used. And this is going to be called obj_projectile. And I'm going to add a create event. When my projectile gets created, I want to give it some basic bit of information. I'll specify a direction. This is going to be equal to point. Actually, let me zoom in for y'all. It's point_direction, open parentheses, specify our origin point, and then this is going to be aiming towards our X and our Y value for the mouse. It's going to go towards our cursor. But I don't want it to all go just perfectly straight because that would kind of ruin the looks of it. Let me go ahead and demonstrate what that would look like. Let me specify speed. This is in pixels per frame, how many pixels it's moving every frame or step in our case. And then our image angle is going to be equal to whatever the direction is that we've set out. We're going to modify the direction in a bit, but I want you to see what this looks like before we do that. So this is all we've got. We just have a create event for our projectile. Create projectile. Or more appropriately, initializes values for projectile. But the process of actually launching the stuff, that is not done by our projectile. That's actually created by the player object. Let's go over to the player object and add in a little bit of code. So I double left clicked on the player object. That brought us back over here. We left open the step event. So let's zoom in on the step event. And this is launching our projectile. So if our mouse check button, and we specify, I'm checking if the left button underscore left has been pressed, I want to do something. Specifically, I want to create a new instance layer at our origin point, our X and Y value, on the present layer that we're on. And I want to specify I'm going to create my projectile. So whenever the left mouse button is pressed, create a new instance layer at our origin point on the same layer as us of our object projectile. So let's go ahead and run this and let us see what we get on the canvas. So again, moving around, following the cursor, I press left click and you see a small stream of shots coming out. It goes perfectly straight, but generally, to add more of an effect, it should not be moving or shooting so quickly. This is essentially like if we had a machine gun just going rapidly. And there should be some variety. It shouldn't just be a perfectly straight line. So let's go back over to our code and add a little bit of randomization. Let's go back to the projectile object, back to the create event, and let's add a little bit of spice to our direction. Direction is going to be plus equals. I'm going to add to it a little bit of variety. If we use a random range, this will create a random number, in our case, between -4 and 4. And so this will represent our drift. It's plus or minus 4 degrees of up to 4 degrees of our cursor. So it's not going to be perfect. Now there's going to be a little bit of scatter. If we come back to run this, we should see what that scatter does. So you see it's now a lot more of a scatter effect and it looks a little bit more interesting. I haven't moved my cursor at all, and yet we have this variety. But what if we didn't want to be shooting at 1,000,000 miles an hour? What if we wanted to add a cooldown effect? I'm going back to our player object. I'm going to go to making a create event. In our create event, again, this initializes values for player. Let's zoom in a bit on here. Here, I'm going to specify a new variable called cooldown. I'm going to set it equal to 0. That's all we need in our create event. It's giving us a warning, just telling us, hey, this is the only spot this is used. Let's fix that problem. Let's go over to the step event. In our step event, Let's scroll down and integrate our cooldown with the rest of our code. And so every step, I want my cooldown to reduce itself. So minus equals 1. We could also do minus minus, but just in case you want to switch how your cooldown works, I'm leaving it at that. Then inside of here, if we have shot, I'm going to add a cooldown or set the cooldown to be 10 seconds. So however long or however much time was from the last time I shot, I have to wait at least 10 frames. I said seconds earlier, this is actually frames. 10 steps before next shot. And then I need to update our actual condition in here. If our mouse check button, if we've pressed the left mouse button and the cooldown is less than or equal to 0, then I can shoot. This is going to slow down how quickly we can shoot because we're running at 30 frames per second, 30 steps. That means with a cooldown of 10, and the cooldown only goes down by 1 every step, in a single second, I can only launch 3 projectiles. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. Now, if I click, it is much slower. Due to our 10 frame cooldown, I only have 1 shot every 10 frames, 3 shots every second. Now you can play around with that, modify it, change it. Maybe you want a longer cooldown, only 2 shots per second. Maybe you want a lot more shots. Bring it down to 5, you've got 6 shots per second. Whatever you want to do, this is your game. Play around with it, tweak these numbers. But this is how we can create a projectile, creating the sprite, creating the projectile object, and getting our player object to launch the projectiles, have a cooldown, follow the cursor, or look at the cursor, and get it all looking nice and reasonable with some scatter all put together. So if you have any questions or need any clarification, just ask me in class and I'll see what I can do. Otherwise, thank you.